Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I am your host, Ozzy Ostwald. Making up less than 1% of the population of most counties in Appalachia, Roman Catholics do not have a very obvious presence in our mountain communities. One might drive for hours and see dozens of Baptist churches before coming across a Catholic parish. However, through mission activities and social justice advocacy, Catholics in Appalachia have an outsized impact. My guest today, Elise Johnson, is an Appalachian Studies graduate student who was raised Roman Catholic and has some unique perspectives on being Catholic in Appalachia. Welcome, Elise.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so you're from Baltimore.
Yes, I am. I grew up right outside of Baltimore, and I love it there. I love Maryland.
And of course, Maryland's a long-time hotbed for Roman Catholicism because it was established as a Catholic colony early on.
Absolutely. Catholicism is huge in Maryland. I went to Catholic school for my whole life, and there is a lot of that. There's so many Catholic churches, so many Catholic schools all throughout Maryland.
Well, I want to ask you about your experience growing up Catholic, but first I want to know how a Catholic girl from Baltimore ends up in Boone, North Carolina, studying Appalachian studies.
Yes, it is an interesting story. So, like I said, I grew up in Baltimore. My mother's family is Italian Catholic, but my dad's family has actually been in Appalachia since the 17th century. So, they came here, settled here, been here for a long time, and specifically, actually, in what is now known as Watauga County and Wilkes County specifically. So we've been here for a long time. My dad was actually one of the first in his family to move out of Appalachia. So he moved to DC, met my mom, and that's how I ended up, that's why we were in Maryland. But his whole family, like I said, is from here. So I do talk to them, and I was talking to one of my aunts, my great aunt Esther, one day. She's very dear to me. And we started talking just about family history, and I realized there was so much about my Appalachian side of the family that I just didn't know. So she's telling me such interesting things about my great-grandmother, Marticia Hayes, who was a medicine woman in her community that I had never heard of her or anything that, I didn't know any of her work. So I decided that I did want to do my graduate studies and focus on that, and I was actually encouraged by a professor at my undergrad University of Delaware, to look into Appalachian Studies programs.
We're glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here too.
And you're not only interested in Catholics in Appalachia, although that is one of your interests. You're also interested in indigenous cultures and spiritual traditions.
I am, yes. So I'm doing research right now for the state of Virginia on Hungry Mother State Park and looking at the origin of that very unique name from the indigenous perspective. So yes, so indigenous history and culture, specifically Cherokee, is very interesting to me too.
And this is part of your heritage?
No, it's not.
It's just, but you got interested in it?
I did, yes. I'm very interested in it.
And this is your main focus, I think.
It is, definitely, is indigenous Appalachia. That's really what I love.
So why do you think that Roman Catholicism has such a small presence in terms of overall population? In Appalachia? Is it just migration patterns, or is there more to it than that?
I think there's more to it, and it's interesting being from Maryland, understanding that, one of the big reasons that Catholicism is not as big in Appalachia is because of the Catholics that were in Maryland while Appalachia was being settled, which is interesting. So we see that Catholics in Maryland, Maryland is it was a Catholic colony, but they recognized that their position in the colonies, because they were Catholic, was a little bit precarious, we'll say. And so I think that...
So they were marginalized even in Maryland.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay. And so I think that as a way to... they didn't want to draw too much attention to themselves. And so I think while other maybe Protestant religions were sending people into Appalachia to on these missions and to evangelize, we don't see Catholics doing that as much because they didn't want to bring any more attention to themselves. I think especially early on when when there were first English settlers in the United States, that was definitely the reason for it.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier that Methodists and Baptists are well known for their evangelical
Yes,
talent, right?
yes.
But you said that Catholics are really into evangelizing as well.
Right. So when I was learning about this, about why Catholicism isn't as prevalent in Appalachia, I was so interested to hear that it was because they weren't doing a lot of evangelization here. Because in my view, and what I was taught in Catholic high school, and all throughout my Catholic schooling, was that it is our job as Catholics to spread the gospel, spread the good news, and to evangelize. So that really surprised me that they didn't in Appalachia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've been reading together some works on Catholics in Appalachia.
yes.
So one of the things that one of our authors has mentioned is that there's a problem with finding enough clergy
Right.
for parishes
Sure.
in the New World, because there were no seminaries early on, and you
Right.
have to go to a Catholic seminary,
Yes.
and the priesthood is all male,
Yes.
and it's celibate. So perhaps the supply is not as high as in
Sure.
Protestant churches.
Definitely, and I think that that's such an interesting thing, and it's a good thing, right? That I think it's a good thing that Catholics, want their clergy to be these very highly educated people, but but I do think that made it very difficult for Catholicism to take root in Appalachia, because if you were here, even if you were already Catholic, it was hard to become a priest, because you would have to go elsewhere, potentially very, very far, in order to go to attend seminary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And dangerous
Absolutely.
crossing the Atlantic at that time.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely.
So another thing here is that if you have a limited supply,
Right.
most of those highly educated men, as you described them,
Yes.
wanted to be in urban areas where
Yes.
access to further education was
Yes.
readily available. And
And we do see that, I think, in part because a lot of these Catholic priests didn't want to go into these isolated rural communities. They preferred to be in these urban, already established Catholic communities, which they could get in sort of the Northeast and definitely in Maryland.
so because of migration patterns in
Yes.
Appalachia, there were a lot of Irish Protestants.
Yes.
There were a lot of Scots Highlanders who
Right.
were Protestants.
Right.
Do you think that there is evidence of anti-Catholic sentiment in Appalachia as there might have been elsewhere, or?
I do. I think what's interesting about the fact that there were these early settlers who actually were Catholic, that was another reason that I was so surprised that Catholicism didn't take root, right? But we see that I think the English Catholics that were in Maryland who had better access, more access to seminaries and this formal education, didn't want to come to Appalachia because they saw themselves as different and maybe better than the types of Catholics that were settling in Appalachia. So I think that that's something interesting too. But I think that there has also been in more recent years, especially as you had this not recent years, but with the influx of a lot of Southern European immigrants in the late sort of 19th, early 20th century, I think you do start to see a lot of people in Appalachia associating Catholicism with immigrants and with being foreign and not from here. And so I think that has caused some disdain maybe for Catholics in the region.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier that one of your professors said that
Yes.
Catholics weren't much liked in the
Yeah.
Appalachian region.
Yes.
And it sounds to me like what I'm hearing you say is that it's not only kind of Protestant distrust of foreignness,
Right.
but there's also some kind of internecine tension between Catholics from England
Right.
versus Catholics from the Mediterranean region
Yes.
versus Catholics from
Yes.
France.
I definitely
Yeah.
think that plays a part in it. And I think, again, with sort of these in the coal mining communities, and we see a lot of Italian immigrants coming specifically to work in coal mines and in logging towns as well in Appalachia. When they're coming in, say, the early 20th century, they're really holding on to their Catholicism because they're entering a place where a lot of people are not Catholic. They're seen as outsiders already. And so I think that was a way to build community for these immigrants, to build community and find solace with people who practice the same religion as them.
Religion can be a kind of cultural glue.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that religion does really well is create community,
Absolutely.
particularly for marginalized communities.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think especially for, I'll speak to the Italian perspective. I think for a lot of Italians, Catholicism is so important to our culture. It's more than just a religion. It's deeply ingrained in so many things that we do. So I think that for those Italian Catholic immigrants, it makes sense that they held so tightly to it. It gave them comfort.
Yeah. So while Baptists and Methodists were taming the frontier and
Yes.
establishing churches everywhere,
Yes,
Catholic priests were staying in urban centers.
were.
But they're the earliest Catholic parish, I believe, in
Yes.
Appalachia, and we've got an image here of it, if we can get that first image up, is St. Peter's Catholic Parish in Harpers Ferry,
Yeah.
West Virginia. It's a lovely
It is.
building here, and you don't see many cathedrals with mountains, with
Right.
Appalachian Mountains in
You
the
don't.
backdrop. So this is kind of a nice image.
It is.
This is not the original building, but the parish was established in 1823, which
Right.
is pretty early.
It is, definitely.
But the interesting thing here, well, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was
Anna?
just going to say that it's something interesting about Harpers Ferry is that it is very close to Baltimore, which you
Yeah.
know, and so I think that probably is a big reason that this exists here, because I think that Harpers Ferry was sort of framed as this like beautiful mountain place that was easy to get to from Baltimore. So it makes sense that if you're getting, say, a lot of visitors coming from Baltimore and coming from these urban centers that are very Catholic, it would make sense that they would want to have a Catholic church, so when they did come to visit, they could go to Mass.
Yeah, it's about 90 minutes, I think.
Right.
So probably the closest mountain getaway.
It is, yeah.
And that's a pattern that still exists today
Sure.
with migration into the area now, second home people
Right.
from the Northeast and Florida.
Definitely.
Oftentimes land in Catholic parishes.
Yes,
So
yes.
that's still going on
Yeah, it
today.
definitely is. It definitely is.
So you had mentioned just a few minutes ago the southern Mediterranean
Yes.
influx of Catholics
Sure.
into Appalachia. I've got a second image here.
Yes.
And I love this image.
Yes.
It's Our Lady of the Mines, and it's a kind of typical Mary with Jesus,
Right.
Madonna and child
Right.
image, but they're sitting out in front of a Kentucky coal mine.
Yes, yes. I think this image is beautiful, and I think that it makes sense, right? Because you have all these Italian coal miners, right? They would want to sort of, this is a way to make their Catholicism relevant also to their work. And I think that that's really meaningful. So, yeah, very beautiful.
And this migration from the Mediterranean, this was more after World War II or 20th century in general, or?
From my understanding, and I think in Appalachia specifically, we do see a decent amount of at least Italian immigration happening in the late 19th century, very early 20th century. And like I know from like my family in particular, my family came in the early 20th century. So actually, probably right around the same time as World War I.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think you see an uptick around then.
Yeah. So one of the articles we've read together,
Yes.
the author mentions that the complexion, I guess, of Appalachian migration or Catholic migration into Appalachia
Yes.
changed in the 20th century,
Right.
and there was an uptick after World War II in the latter part of the 20th century.
Definitely.
More and more Catholic parishes are being established.
Sure.
And I did a quick Google search
Yes.
today, and one of the things that struck me is that it seems like most of these parishes are small.
Right.
One that I looked at had 16 families.
Oh
you know.
my goodness.
And but it seems like that one of the first things that happens when a parish is established in Appalachia, and maybe this is elsewhere too,
Yes.
is that it's established with a real focus on kind of social justice issues, and that most of these Catholic parishes attack problems like poverty,
They do.
the climate crisis, and so forth.
Sure.
Is this kind of typical of Catholicism nationwide, or is this a focus here? And I can see why the climate would be a focus in an area like the mountains.
Yes. I mean, I think that is pretty standard for Catholicism. I think that, the Catholic Church has these movements that they are very passionate about. And I would say that education, particularly for one sect of Catholicism, the Jesuits, is very important, right? So if they find somewhere, maybe like Appalachia, that is deemed needing help in that area, I think that they are very willing to go. And poverty is obviously an issue that the Catholic Church is very passionate about. So it would make sense then, in Appalachia specifically, I would say that they would want to come here and sort of evangelize, but also go into the community and not only spread Catholicism, but also just help these communities in terms of education and poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Jesuits you mentioned
Yes, yes.
are really good missionaries too, right?
They are, yes, yes. The Jesuits are, a lot of the Catholic schools in Maryland are Jesuit.
Well, I think a lot of the early Catholic presence in Appalachia was Jesuit.
Yes, and that would make sense.
In the 19th century,
Right,
especially.
right.
Yeah. So you mentioned education as a real
did.
concern.
I did.
Poverty is a real concern. Climate care is a real concern.
Yes, definitely.
So I've got this next picture here. One of the groups that I found is the Sisters Appalachian Mission,
Yes.
and it's lay women, okay, who are committed to addressing poverty in the community, and they are connected to a group in Ohio and Kentucky called the Sisters of St. Francis.
Okay, yes,
Established in 1867 to minister to orphans and the elderly.
Right.
And now they, it's almost like an American monastic community. These women take a vow of poverty, as you would imagine,
Yes.
being St. Francis,
Yes,
connected
yes,
to Francis.
yes.
A vow of celibacy and a vow of obedience. It
Yes.
sounds very monastic, doesn't it?
It does, it does, yes. And but I do still think that it is very standard with Catholicism, nationally. I think that those are important sort of facets of it, and reaching out into your community and all of that.
Yeah. The other group I found, let's get another image up here. The Catholic Committee of Appalachia. Have you, raising a prophetic voice since 1970, have you ever heard of this group?
I have not heard of this group specifically, but I think that it makes sense if we're seeing 1970, like you said. I think that there was definitely an uptick in Catholics in the region and Catholic evangelization in the region that hadn't really been here prior to that. And that was why it didn't exist. That's why there wasn't a lot of Catholicism prior to that. But now we see more of it.
So we were talking earlier, and you happened to mention that perhaps the most famous Catholic family in the United States.
Yes, I did.
Which almost royalty too,
Yes.
is the Kennedy family.
Yes, I think they played an interesting role in the way that Catholics might be viewed in Appalachia, but also the way that Appalachia is viewed by Catholics. I think it's a reciprocal thing. So I think that for Catholics, I think that the Kennedys bringing so much attention to Appalachia, and then later Johnson, of course, with the war on poverty, it brought that to the forefront of the Catholic mind, essentially. And so I think that that would make sense that around 1970, right, so not too long after the Kennedys and Johnson and all these things, and the war on poverty, we see an uptick in Catholicism, because Catholics see, well, our President Kennedy, who is Catholic, sees this as an important thing for us to be doing, and so we're going to do it. But interestingly, I've also been told that in Appalachia, Kennedy being Catholic, President Kennedy being Catholic, was a deterrent for voting for him, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. And I think that was probably across the South.
Yes,
maybe
yes.
to a lesser extent.
Sure, yes.
So, so we have Protestants in Appalachia who are afraid to vote for a Catholic president or a Catholic candidate.
Sure.
Even though later that president happened to address poverty in Appalachia. But you said that he wasn't very liked in Appalachia even after he was elected.
From my understanding, no. And I think that, I don't think the war on poverty helped that, because from what I've heard from family members and just other people in the Appalachian community, is that the way that the war on poverty, the methods maybe, the intent I think was good, but I think sometimes the methods were a little bit.
And you mentioned, I mean, the Kennedys, plural.
Yes.
So
Yes.
John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy,
Yes.
Attorney General during Kennedy's administration, was one of the leaders of this, the public face of the war on poverty. And he came specifically to Appalachia, and I think to kind of put a white face on the problem of poverty, so that it wasn't just a civil rights issue.
Right. I also wonder if maybe that's part of the reason that other Catholics, other white Catholics, maybe saw it as a place that they should go into and start helping more, because they were seeing this white poverty, and that was deemed important to them.
Yeah.
So I wonder.
Yeah, and but I wonder if Robert Kennedy was liked any better after he made his.
I don't know. That I don't know. I'd be curious to know that too.
Yeah. So going back to some of your background here, I know you're interested in Catholicism in
I am.
Appalachia. You're interested in indigenous traditions
I am.
and folk traditions.
I am.
Is there a common thread here, or is it just that you have these different interests?
I think that the Catholicism thing is really just based off of my upbringing. I think that that makes me very interested in it. But I have been interested for a long time in sort of the ways that the folk practices of Appalachia and like folk medicine and sort of folk magic specifically have connected to Cherokee folk practices as well. And so, but you also can see some links to early sort of Irish Catholicism in some of these practices as well. So I do think that there is sort of a little corner there that has all of them. I don't usually focus on all of them at once.
So what? I'm interested. I want to follow up on this. Interested in what you see to be the connection between folk practices and Irish Catholicism or indigenous practices.
Yes.
Is it the engagement of the supernatural in everyday life?
I think it is, because I think that Catholicism is an interesting religion, and I will speak again for Italian Catholicism because there is this interesting overlap of superstition and religion that is very unique to Italian Catholicism, but that you also see in Appalachia. So I'm really interested in that, and I wonder if maybe that is because there is this, because maybe it's a little bit, I don't know, more, Catholicism maybe is a little bit more amenable to these like folk practices.
Well, there's the sacramental system.
Right.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Just the idea that one can engage the supernatural through practices.
Yes.
Here,
Right.
Whether it's baptism or communion
Right.
or confession.
Yes.
So it seems to me that Catholicism in general is perhaps a little more open to the idea of the supernatural breaking into the natural world.
I think so. And you see that in Appalachia, and that's always been a little bit incongruous, if that's the word, to me in Appalachia, because when I think of more Protestant religions, from my understanding, they're not as open to that. But the people that are practicing this Appalachian folk medicine and magic are often Protestant. So I don't know where that's coming from.
Do you think the role that the saints play in Catholicism provide a little more immediacy, I guess, or between the supernatural and
maybe. I mean, we know that the saints are important to Catholics, right? And I guess yes, I would say yes, because they're actual people who have experienced miracles or perform miracles, things like that. So it does make the supernatural a little bit more tangible, maybe. So.
Yeah, I think in general, Catholicism is perhaps more open to the miraculous.
I think so too. But then you also see that, I think, in Appalachia, which is where it's so interesting, and I think that there is that connection.
So there is an interesting kind of connection here going on.
Definitely. But then you also have, and something I'm really interested in too, is this specifically Cherokee. I talk about Cherokee a lot, especially like here specifically, influence in the folk practices and the folk medicine especially. They know the medicine that's here, right? And they share that with the white settlers, and that's why white Appalachian folk medicine practitioners are able to know that.
So you mentioned earlier too some of the, I guess, inconveniences of being Catholic in Appalachia. Here in Boone, which is a university town, right? A thriving little city.
Yes.
But there's only one Catholic parish.
Yes, that was so strange to me and surprising. So obviously, you know, the example I give is Ash Wednesday. So when I was living in Maryland, I was always in Catholic school, so we would just go to Mass that day and get our ashes. But and then when I went to the University of Delaware, there was a lot of Catholicism there as well. So I was able to, you know, I had my choice of where I wanted to go get my ashes on Ash Wednesday. But then last year, when I came to App State, I was so surprised to find that there was really only one church that I could go to get my ashes. So yeah, it was very interesting to me. I felt a little spoiled.
Tell me about that one church. You know, you don't have to go into specifics, but did you find that the atmosphere or anything with the church here is different than what you were used to in maybe a more Catholic area?
I don't know. I think it was a very beautiful church, and it was funny. It reminded me of what you were saying about you don't often see these beautiful churches like nestled in the mountains, right? So it's fun. It has beautiful views, all these things, which I was not used to seeing in church.
Right.
But I really enjoyed the services that I attended there. It did in some ways feel very modern, which I think a lot of churches, Catholic churches, are starting to do, especially nowadays, because it makes it easier for people to digest, I think, and they want to attract people, which makes sense. So it is a little bit more modern than if you're thinking about like a big cathedral, maybe in like Baltimore, like the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen is very traditional. But yeah, it was very pretty.
Yeah,
very
we're used to
beautiful.
seeing these spectacular
Right,
cathedrals
right,
in Europe
right.
or
Yes, yes.
in Baltimore.
Yes,
Montreal is
sure, of
Notre
course.
Dame in Montreal. So to see a more a smaller to
Yes,
start with in
surely,
a more
surely.
modern setting doesn't seem to resonate
Yes.
with my own stereotypical images of Catholic worship.
But I will say too that the church, it was a very lively service because it was so full. Because I think there's only this one, right? And because they have a couple of mass times, but this was like I went to one on a Sunday morning. I went to a couple on Sunday mornings, and it was a popular time, and so it was fun because it felt like pretty much all the Catholics in this community are probably here with me right now.
Yeah. So we had talked earlier too about a project that you had done years ago.
Yes.
This doesn't really have much to do with Appalachia, but it has to do with Catholicism and culture.
Yes.
And you were comparing Catholicism in New Orleans
I was.
to Catholicism in Maryland.
Right,
So now
right.
you got a third leg of the stool. You can pull Appalachia in here
Definitely.
too. But what are some of the fundamental differences between, because Protestants think Catholicism is the same everywhere.
Sure,
right?
sure.
But you found some real interesting and significant
Distinct.
differences.
Definitely. So in Maryland, we see this sort of English branch of Catholicism, but in New Orleans, you see this French Catholicism, which is very different. In New Orleans, I would also say that there is definitely an influence of enslavement there, and the people that were enslaved, particularly coming from West Africa, West African countries, I should say, and sort of their religion. And it's interesting there specifically to see how those two things have intersected. But I think you could take it back to that argument about Catholicism being a little bit more open, maybe, to some of these like supernatural elements than maybe some Protestant religions. So yeah, we see some interesting intersections in New Orleans that are very different than Catholicism in Maryland.
Catholicism has been adaptable in America.
Definitely.
It's had to be, right?
I think so, yes. I mean, something that, I've heard religious scholars call elitism in Maryland Catholicism, I think also influences this a lot. I really do. I mean, because they were trying to keep themselves out of the public eye, but they were also trying to keep, their brand of Catholicism how they wanted it.
Yeah. So you're going to be graduating
I am.
soon, and
I am.
so in the minute or so we have left, maybe you
Yes.
can tell us about. Are you going to take these studies into the classroom? What are you going to be teaching?
I hope so, yes. So I'm hoping to teach history, and I think that specifically American history, that's really interesting to me. And that was part of the reason that I came to App State too, is because I think that Appalachian history is so overlooked generally, but it is such an important part of U.S. history as a whole. I know I learned very little about Appalachia, so I'm excited to incorporate that. And I've also, I may teach in a Catholic school, so seeing where religion fits into all of this can also be interesting though.
And you're going back to Maryland, too.
I am
Yeah,
going back
that's
to Maryland,
great.
yes.
Well, we're happy to have had you here for the 2 years or so we've
Thank
had you, and I
Happy to be
appreciate you
here.
coming on. Your students are going to love you when you
Oh,
get
thank
settled
you,
in the
thank
classroom.
you. I
Thank you so
appreciate it.
much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. I hope you'll join us again next week here on App TV. Our focus will be religion and health. Until then, this is Ozzy Ostwald.